And now we welcome to the stage our next speaker, Emilija Sagaityte. Emilija is a sophomore at Radnor High School. She has been exploring an issue that is overlooked as a problem in society, which affects many of us more than we know. So here is Emilija with her talk entitled The Hardest Hit.
So there are many problems in our society, ranging from environmental to political. However, sometimes it is the smaller ones that impact us most closely and most directly. So by a show of hands, how many of you have ever suffered from a head injury due to sports? Anyone? Oh, yeah, okay, so we have a few, right? Well, so seeing as about 21% of the 1.6 to 3.8 million children that suffer from head injuries get them due to sports, this is a major problem. And it's one of the reasons why concussions was one of the first things that came into my mind when I thought of a common health issue in our society. So I also recently spoke to Mr. Kevin Schneider, who is the athletic trainer here at our high school, and he said that he sees about 20 to 30 students get concussions annually at our school, which is still a pretty large amount. So as you can see in the chart up here, it shows the number of head injuries in various types of sports in high school compared to college. And while many of them are more common in college, a significant amount of them in sports such as football or women's soccer are more common in high school, indicating that we in fact should think about which sports we play, when we play them, and how we play them. So to give you a brief background on concussions, in case you don't know, they're considered a mild form of a traumatic brain injury, or TBI, which is basically any hit to the head or the body that disrupts the functioning of the brain. Now, concussions can be single concussions, or they can be multiple concussions, which means you get one and then you get another one before you heal from the previous one. And this can lead to more serious problems, thus impacting not only the individual who gets injured, but also their coaches, their teachers, and the people around them, because they can no longer participate in their daily activities. To give you an example, there was one high school student named Journey Bailey, and he decided to write about what he went through for the Huffington Post. So he played football and he had suffered many head injuries, but one time he faced one that was extremely severe, and unfortunately he wound up in the hospital with oxygen tubes, and afterwards he was impacted not only athletically but also academically and emotionally. And as a result, he wrote about how he didn't think that playing football was really worth the impact that it then had on his life. So what can develop over time if you have many concussions over a long period of time is an irreversible condition called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. And on the images on the screen, you can see that have cells of a healthy brain, and then those of a football player and a boxer who have suffered from CTE. So clearly the brains of the players are much more damaged, more deteriorated, and this is what can happen every time you suffer from a head injury, if that happens to you very often. But so then, why are head injuries so important when we're young? Well, while we may all think we're adults by the age of 18, our brains in fact keep developing until we're at least 25 years old. So really, any injury we suffer, whether it be in middle, high school, or even college, can have a serious and lasting impact on our heads and really our brains. But while many head injuries and concussions are often associated with professional leagues and professional sports teams like the NFL, they are in fact something that is very prevalent among our youth and adolescents, even in our own communities. To get an idea of this, I spoke to a pediatrician over at Paoli. His name is Dr. Andrew Forman, and he said that about 85% of the kids he sees at the primary care level that suffer from head injuries get them as a result of sports, most of them being football and soccer players in high school, and usually suffering single concussions. He has, however, seen students suffer from multiple concussions, and they then had to go on to rehab. There is, however, the acute concussion evaluation, or ACE form, that is used to determine a person's status and whether they have a concussion and the severity of it. And it's basically just someone filling out a form describing their symptoms. Then if it is determined that they do have a concussion, then they might have to wait 7 to 14 days and go through a very long process of multiple stages before they can resume with their normal daily activities. But then aside from this, there are also impediments to finding out if the person even really has a concussion. For example, 47% of people say they don't even notice it because it might be so minor. Then another problem is honesty and whether the player will truly admit the symptoms that they have if they want to keep playing. There is also the issue of some concussions having symptoms, symptoms, not true, okay, there we go. So having symptoms similar to, having symptoms similar to those of an illness like the flu. And so in that case, it's hard to see whether they have an actual head injury or whether they are just plainly sick. Finally, there's the issue of coaches and parents not realizing if someone's hit and not taking them out of the game ahead of time. Then to get the flip side of things, I talked to our athletic director here at Radnor High School. His name is Mr. Michael Friel, and he described some of the changes that have been made in sports and schools in order to help solve the problem of head injuries. So in football and wrestling, they have taught people how to tackle and wrestle and how to fall properly, and they have limited the amount of playing time in their actual gear in football. They have also instituted a new foul rule in lacrosse where if someone hits someone over the shoulders, then the person who hit them suffers a penalty. And this is basically to discourage people from hitting the ball too high and causing someone else to get a concussion. They have also started to standardize the baseline test, which is pretty similar to the ACE test in the sense that it can help determine if the person is suffering from some kind of head injury or trauma. But so then, even with these changes, if we think about the lengthy process that it takes in order to heal from a concussion and all the difficulties in even finding out sometimes if the person has one, what if we could not only cure concussions, but what if we could stop them at the root and prevent them from happening in the first place? Well, people have thought of that, and they started coming up with solutions and regulations for it. So, for example, in soccer, they have now created a law that says that if you're younger than 11, you cannot head the ball, and if you're younger than 14, you can only head the ball a limited number of times. But when I read this, and what you're probably thinking right now is, so say you have a coach, he's surrounded by 20 kids, he turns around, and the next thing you know, you have 10 kids behind him happily bouncing a ball on their heads. So clearly, some of these rules may not be able to be implemented as well as we would like them to be. So then comes the whole debate over helmets. One group of people says that helmets are not necessary because without that protection, kids may feel more exposed, they may be less likely to try in games, and they may not put themselves in risky situations. But then on the flip side, you think about the large number of concussions that occur not because someone wrestles someone to the ground or because they tackle someone, but simply because they're standing and maybe a ball just hits them in the head and they get a head injury that way. Well, if they are without a helmet, then they're essentially potentially at risk for an injury that they could have easily avoided. And people who have this mindset have now started implementing helmets to sports that usually have not had them before. So pictured up on the screen is an example of 2 types of soccer helmets that have now been used, and there have also been helmets in Florida applied to girls' lacrosse as well. Of course, there is no proof whether these helmets are going to be very beneficial, but there is still a chance that they may become more common and that they may prove to prevent head injuries in the future. But then what I came across that I found especially fascinating was the whole idea of military technology being applied to sports. Now, most of this technology is targeted towards the NFL and other professional football leagues and professional sports teams, but in reality, a lot of them can't be used for really good players because they may hinder a player's ability to perform well, but they might eventually make their way down to high schools and even middle schools. Pictured up on the board, we have an example of an army strap that came from the Army Research Lab. And what it does is it basically would cushion the head in the case that a player would fall or get hit in the head. And this would thus prevent the brain from moving as much and would make it less likely for that person to suffer from a head injury. The problem, though, is that if you were to use something like this, you need additional gear on top of your, say, football gear, and so that may cause the player to not perform as well. It might be too bulky, but it still could prove as a solution for younger players. Then here is a map from the Viconic company, and it would essentially go under a turf field so that it could cushion someone's head if they were to fall. Many football fields are grass, so this could not be used, but when you think about fields such as our high school fields, this is something that could be easily implemented. Then we have a new helmet that was developed by the University of Washington. Now, rather than just having, say, one layer of protection, this type of helmet would have multiple layers of protection that would help spread out the impact in the case that someone were to get hit in the head with a ball, and could thus help prevent concussion from happening. But so thinking about all of these different regulations and technologies that are being used, I think that it all really comes down to the idea of pressure and education. So when we think about pressure, obviously no parent wants their child to go in a game and get injured. But at the same time, we always want to encourage them, and they say, hey, go out there, give it your all, put in your best effort, and this is great. But when you say this to a very little kid, they may get the wrong idea, and they might essentially try too hard and put themselves in situations where they could get seriously injured, and they could suffer from a concussion. So then this leads into the idea of education. And I don't just mean education for the coaches and the parents so that they wouldn't recognize when someone has had a head injury. I mean education for the kids, the actual players, whether they be in college, high school, middle school, maybe even elementary school. Of course, no child, especially 10 or 11 years old, would want to sit and listen to a 20-minute lecture on head injuries and the types and all of that boring facts and everything. But in reality, I think that this is something that would be very important, even if most of that information would fly out of their heads the second they left the room. Because as long as we inform them of the causes to concussions, how to avoid them, and then also the fact that they can cause severe damage, I think this is something that they could keep in the backs of their minds while they play and stay conscious of their decisions in the game. At the very minimum, they should be aware that a concussion isn't an equivalent to a sore finger. It is a serious injury. Now, needless to say, this doesn't mean that we should all start playing sports. Not that this would even ever really happen, because I'm sure most of us will always want to try at least one once in our lives. But the important thing is that we should stay conscious and keep in mind the fact that a concussion may not just last those 7 to 14 days and then you're healthy and on your way. A concussion could essentially impact you for the rest of your life in very negative ways, and it could harm you very seriously. So I think it is especially important for children and teenagers to know this, so that when they play, they could stop and think. And they would think about whether that one goal, whether that one point in that one single game that they may not even remember in 5 years is really worth the risk. Thank you.